Welcome to our special coverage of the origins of ISIS. ISIS, the most brutally violent terror group in modern history, and a year ago, you'd never even heard of them. That's because ISIS isn't an old terror group. They are newly formed, newly armed, and newly funded. Today, we're going to talk about where this group comes from, how they are sustained, and where they're headed next. So where to begin? Well, the story of ISIS actually begins in 2003 when the U.S. invaded Iraq to topple Saddam Hussein. As a war effort, it didn't take much, but the cost was high. The U.S. not only removed Hussein from power, but we also destroyed much of Iraq's infrastructure. We dismantled and then attempted to rebuild the Iraqi army. More on that in a minute. We also helped to install a government that was not responsive to the people. We imprisoned thousands of men who we deemed as radicals, giving them access to each other. And most importantly, we left a destabilized, weak country with destroyed infrastructure and huge amounts of American military gear. So where does ISIS come into all of this? Well, ISIS actually formed as a small insurgent group in Iraq in 2006. And while they tried to create problems for the U.S. military, they had no money and no real ability to recruit. It wasn't until 2009 that ISIS shifted its focus from Iraq, where it was largely unsuccessful in developing a foothold, and focused on Syria. By 2011, the Syrian civil war was getting underway, and ISIS had its chance. In June of 2013, a northern general for the Free Syrian Army spoke out on Al Jazeera, Qatar, and stated that if international forces did not send weapons, the rebels attempting to overthrow Syrian President Bashar al-Assad would lose their war within a month. Well, within just a matter of weeks of that Syrian general making his plea for international help, the U.S., the Saudis, Jordan, Qatar, Turkey, and Israel began providing weapons, training, and money to the so-called rebel groups like the Free Syrian Army. By September of 2013, American media outlets began reporting that weapons were being given to Syrian rebels. CNN reported that while the weapons were not American-made, they were funded and organized by the CIA. And this is where things all fell apart. Within less than 1 year after the U.S. supplied those Syrian so-called freedom fighters with weapons, those weapons ended up in the hands of ISIS fighters. In fact, American media also began to report that the Free Syrian Army had fighters defecting from their ranks and joining with ISIS. By the time ISIS began to make headlines, President Obama himself acted as if ISIS were nothing to be worried about.
We're leaving behind a sovereign, stable, and self-reliant Iraq.
The United States will not pursue military options that support one sect inside of Iraq at the expense of another. There's no military solution inside of Iraq, certainly not one that is led by the United States.
I think it's fair to say that their extreme ideology poses a medium and long-term threat. There are a lot of groups out there that probably have more advanced immediate plans directed against the United States that we have to be on constant guard for.
I've directed our military to take targeted strikes against ISIL terrorist convoys should they move toward the city. We intend to stay vigilant and take action if these terrorist forces threaten our personnel or facilities anywhere in Iraq.
Well, by June of 2014, ISIS had emerged, going from a no-name group in Syria to crossing back over the border and into Iraq. Well, one of the reasons why ISIS was able to become so powerful so quickly was because of their ability to grab up U.S. military gear. We'll talk about that in a minute, but also because of the stunning amount of wealth that they've been accumulating, most of that coming from seizing oil fields in Iraq and in Syria. To combat that, the U.S. has been conducting airstrikes to destroy those fields, a policy that if you step back and think ahead more than 5 minutes, doesn't make a lot of sense. Because when ISIS is defeated, and eventually they will be, the country's infrastructure is already destroyed. Earlier, I spoke with Marin Katusa, the chief energy investment strategist at Casey Research, and I began by asking him why there are no sanctions against oil being sold by ISIS.
Well, essentially, it's what we call in the black market. So there's a buyer that'll buy it at a big discount. This has been going on for decades, and essentially you can't control such items. At the same item, you know, you're looking at ISIS attacked and shut down on the 11 fields, so you're looking at about 400,000 barrels a day that has come offline. So yes, the markets are making a big deal, but considering we produce 92 million, it's not that big of a deal in the big picture.
So you're saying it's impossible to be able to sanction these countries that are purchasing oil from ISIS?
Exactly, because they'll never admit to it, and that's the problem there.